I've been passionate about proportional representation since I was a high school student myself. I was a lot as a high school student. You know, there's a number of you in the audience who've probably heard me speak a number of times and who've probably heard me give my regular speech about the Canadian, kind of spiel about the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, is that we produce and promote research that aims to show people that our best values are possible. But actually, I actually think this topic, electoral reform and proportional representation and this referendum, are key to that proposition. This referendum is a chance to strengthen our democracy, to improve our policy making, but really just to blow open the space of what's possible, to broaden the range of new ideas, and fundamentally, for me, what this represents is a chance to liberate us to vote our values. So we are going to have a mail-in ballot that is going to run from October 22nd, so 2 days after the municipal and school board elections, until the end of November. And I believe it to be an historic opportunity and one that we mustn't let slip through our fingers this time. So my plan with you this afternoon is to walk you through, first of all, why is our current system so messed up? How would proportional representation fix those things? What will actually be on the ballot next month? I'll walk you through the 3 options for change that are on the ballot. There you go. And then talk about what we can actually do to win this thing. So first of all, why is our current system so messed up? Exhibit A, I'm sorry. Put that up there. But, you know, there is this line that, you know, there's this risk if we go with proportional representation of electing extremists. But first past the post can actually put them in power. You know, it's actually the case that the system that we have, first past the post, is the exception, not the norm among democracies. There's actually very few major democracies that still use first past the post. There's the US, there's the UK, there's India and Pakistan and a few smaller former British colonies, and there's us. And look at the record. So the most recent US example, you have Trump losing the popular vote to Clinton, but becoming president, and you have alt-right elements living in the White House. Look at the most recent Indian election, which elected Modi and the BJP, a far-right Hindu nationalist party, with 31% of the vote. They are now government. And Exhibit B, the most recent Canadian example of Doug Ford in Ontario, where with 40% of the popular vote, they won 61% of the seats and have 100% of the political power, and were, as we just saw, even prepared. You know, the one check on political power is the courts, but as we saw, they were willing to even invoke the notwithstanding clause to override that. This is the problem of what we call false majorities that are fundamental to first past the post. A false majority means having less than 50% of the popular vote, but gaining 100% of the power. So these are the results in Ontario in June, where the popular vote broke down with the Ford and the Progressive Conservatives getting 40% of the vote, the NDP about 1/3 of the vote, the Liberals just under 20% of the vote, the Greens just under 5% of the vote. But this is the distribution of seats under first past the post. The Liberals end up, the Conservatives end up with a strong majority. The NDP got about their share of the popular vote, but the Liberals and the Greens considerably less. This is the last federal election, when Trudeau was elected in 2015. I thought as public educators you would appreciate this. So with just under 40% of the vote, they won 55% of the seats, they have 100% of the power, and for 4 years get to decide with impunity which promises they will keep and which promises they will break. But I want to come back to the Ontario election for a minute, because when I was listening to the punditry after the June Ontario election, what I heard a number of times was, oh, Ontarians voted for tax cuts. Well, hold on a second. That's not true. In fact, a majority of Ontarians voted for parties who were proposing exactly the opposite. And so I want to introduce another concept, which is that first past the post produces not just false majorities, but false narratives about who we are and our values. You see that played out in the political map of BC, right? Where in the last BC election, the NDP won almost all the seats on the coast. The Liberals won almost every seat in the interior. And so it creates this story in particular about rural BC, that they're conservative and right-wing and more individualistic. Again, not true. Half of rural BC didn't vote for that. They voted for something else, but it fails to find expression in our system. Now, I want to walk you very quickly through some of the recent BC electoral history. So first of all, the problem with false majorities cuts both ways. In 1996, the NDP actually lost the popular vote to the Liberals, but the Liberal vote was, at the time, was not as efficiently distributed, as they say, and so the NDP won a false majority. 2001, the next election's an interesting one. That was when Gordon Campbell was first elected. And it is actually the only time in the last half century, until the most recent government, that a governing party won an absolute majority of the popular vote. So Gordon Campbell won 57% of the popular vote that year. But remember what happened. It was a wipeout. He won every seat except 2 in East Vancouver. And the NDP lost official party status. So there was no Her Majesty's official opposition. That's not healthy in a democracy. But you'll also, some of you remember, that once he secured that majority, we saw this period between 2002 and 2005 of dramatic cutbacks. That's when all the school closures happened around the province, and cuts to welfare and cuts to environment and children and families. And I want to mention this because one of the lines that's used by the no side is that PR is bad because it erodes local representation. Now, I spent a lot of time traveling around the province in those years after the 2001 election, when all of this grassroots opposition to the cuts were happening. And over again, I heard the same story. My MLA has locked their doors and will not take a meeting. It didn't matter if you had an MLA with an office down the street. Effectively, you did not have local representation. Then in 2005, 2009, 2013, again, the Liberals won false majorities. It's the norm in our system. But here's another problem with first past the post, and it's the problem of forcing people to engage in what we call strategic voting. Strategic voting means not voting your values. So effectively, our elections become this two-horse race between these two parties. The bandwidth of choice in political discourse is narrowed, and we feel forced to vote strategically not for what we want, but against what we most fear or dislike. We've all been there. The system forces us so often to do that. It's not real choice. You see, if you're a free market-oriented person, but you're frustrated with the BC Liberals, right now you have nowhere to go but to hold your nose or opt out. Similarly, if you are a lefty voter, but you're frustrated with the NDP, you have nowhere to go but to suck it up or sit it out. First past the post limits real competition. By the way, I would say that that's why so many of the backroom party apparatchiks who are leading the no side like first past the post. It lets them maintain control and discipline. But our ideas and our values are more diverse than that, and our democracy is healthier when more views and ideas are in play. Another problem with first past the post is the fundamental problem of wasted votes. And it plays out in a couple of ways. First of all, most of us live in safe ridings where the outcome is a foregone conclusion. And a lot of people feel like, well, why bother voting? And frankly, it's kind of hard to blame them. But consider this little statistic. In the last BC election, a little over a year ago, of the 1.9 million votes that were cast, 1.1 of them, so more than half, were cast for a candidate who lost, often in a close race. And the moment that that vote is lost, it's gone. It no longer finds its desired political expression. I am convinced, surely, that we can think more creatively about our democracy, that somehow all of our votes, in one way or another, find their desired political expression. This relates directly to the topic of your conference, because another policy problem with first past the post is that it results in this dynamic that we call policy lurch, meaning as power and false majorities swing between two parties, each new government spends a chunk of its first years essentially undoing the work of the previous government, and so the pendulum goes. And if you want to see what I mean, look no further than the recent Ontario election again, and Ford undoing the Wynne government, or Trump undoing Obama, or Trudeau undoing Harper. It's inefficient, and it's actually bad for business. Like, imagine if you're a green energy person in Ontario, and you've just invested millions, only to have the Ford government undo the entire policy context in which your decision was based. In contrast, because the minority governments produced under pro-rep require compromise across parties, they are more likely to produce policies that have broad appeal and that stand the test of time. All told, it's my view that first past the post is having a negative effect on our democracy. And the disillusionment that results from what I've just described is part of explaining this long-term downward trend in voter turnout. Within the OECD, Canada ranks 26 out of 34 OECD countries when it comes to voter turnout. So, I think we can do better than this antiquated system. By the way, I'm ripping off all kinds of other organizations' slides, but a number of these slides are done by BC Youth for PR. They're actually done by a 16-year-old kid on Salt Spring Island, including this one. So, how would proportional representation fix what I've just walked you through? So first of all, what is proportional representation? Very simple, really. It's not a single system, but a principle. There are numerous models of pro-rep, but they all have in common this. Very simply, your share of the popular vote is reflected in the distribution of seats. So if you get 30% of the vote, you get 30% of the seats, etc. They're stable because, unlike with first past the post, they produce policies with the majority in mind, and you avoid the problem of policy lurch. And they're successful. 9 out of 10 of the top OECD economies use pro-rep. The United States is the only first past the post country that ranks in that top 10. Proportional representation means no more false majorities that rule with impunity, no more false narratives about our values, no more need to engage in strategic voting, no more wasted votes. We get no more diversity of debate and ideas, and less unproductive policy lurches. First past the post, proportional representation almost always produces minority governments. I think that's great. It forces cooperation. Parties have to put together governing alliances that in combination reflect the majority of voters. And if you want to know what that looks like, look no further than our current government in BC with the NDP and the Greens and the confidence and supply agreement that they have that lays out in black and white transparently the basis of their agreement. A common argument against pro-rep is that it produces these unstable governments that can't get anything done. It's not true. Some of our country's most popular and long-lasting policies, from the Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, Medicare itself, are the product of minority federal governments. And in BC, right now, look what we are seeing. This government has just brought in the first major new social program of a generation in public childcare. They have just brought in progressive property tax for the first time in North America. You know, you could accuse them of various things, but failure to be bold does not appear to be one of them. On a related point, pro-rep produces more accountable government. I would contend, and I know some of my friends may disagree with me, but that in the current minority government that we have in BC, the Greens are actually holding the NDP more to account than if the NDP had won a majority outright. I like this outcome, but it's deeper than that. If you only need 40% of the vote to win outright power, you don't need to concern yourself with the other 60%. And you don't feel very accountable to the overall public. So like if we look at the last BC government and we ask ourselves, like, why were they prepared to let welfare rates be frozen for 10 years? Or to drag their feet for so long on the housing affordability crisis? Or to ignore the call for a poverty reduction plan all of those years? I hate to say it, but I think it's because they made a calculation that the people most impacted weren't part of their 40% base. The point is, when every vote counts, Every vote matters. On the policy front, what we actually know from the evidence is that by many measures, PR countries produce better policy and more caring societies. So what we know from the research comparing PR countries versus what's called majoritarian systems like ours, and this is from, Arndt Leipart is really one of the global political science authorities on comparative electoral systems, is that PR countries have less inequality, and the results are highly statistically significant. Similarly, we know that PR countries were faster to adopt the Kyoto Protocol. They have stronger environmental laws. Their share of global GHG emissions is in decline. We know PR countries garner higher scores on the United Nations Index of Human Development, which incorporates health, education, and standard of living indicators. Overall, the empirical research across the OECD countries shows us that PR outperforms winner-take-all systems on measures of democracy, quality of life, income inequality, diversity among elected representatives, values of tolerance, environmental performance, and fiscal policy. I'm not saying that those relationships are causal in all cases, but the arguments, again, the fear-mongering that we hear from the no side about what would happen if we make this change are simply not supported by the evidence. We also know from all of those international comparisons, and the evidence is super clear on this, is that pro-rep systems produce legislatures that better reflect who we are. They outperform in terms of gender representation, they outperform in terms of racialized people representation, outperform in terms of indigenous representation, and that's because any system that uses either party lists or multi-member ridings, the parties would be strategically foolish to bring forward candidate lists that don't reflect that diversity, and so they don't. And the evidence is also clear across the OECD countries that voter turnout is about 7 percentage points higher under pro-rep, and for young people, it is about 12 percentage points higher. And I think it just stands to reason when every vote counts and you're free to vote your values. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about what is actually on the ballot that's coming in our mailboxes in a few weeks. So first of all, yep.
Yeah?
Sure.
Okay. Of the OECDs, is there one that's a close comparison to British Columbia as a province, as either like population size or politically? Like
there's numerous European countries that are similar in certainly population size. New Zealand is an interesting one because their population is very similar to British Columbia's.
Yeah, I'm pro-rep. I'm just trying to wrap my head around where's the comparison.
Yeah, so you can certainly find comparisons that are of a similar population size, but the advantage of looking at the whole of the OECD is there's enough countries there that you're actually able to test for statistical significance, and you find the results that I've shown you.